Welcome to Broken. It's interesting to know that over 90% of our viewers choose not to subscribe. If this video resonates with you, please consider subscribing and hitting that like button. Our goal is to reach 500 likes on this post. Share your insights in the comments to stay up to date with our latest stories. Okay, let's move on. The coastal town of Harborview wore September like a faded shawl. The summer crowds long departed, leaving behind only whispers of laughter in the salt-laden air. Margaret Thorne stood at her kitchen window, watching golden light spill across the wooden deck of the house she'd shared with Henry for 36 years. And still beautiful, though she rarely thought of herself that way anymore. Time had etched its signature into the corners of her eyes, silver threads woven through her once auburn hair, but her gaze remained clear and searching. Henry was upstairs, lost in another of his endless conference calls, his voice a distant tide ebbing and flowing beyond the ceiling. Their retirement to this coastal haven 3 years ago hadn't actually retired him. He remained tethered to his investment firm by invisible wires of obligation and habit. Margaret often wondered if he'd forgotten how to exist without the constant hum of commerce in his ear. She slipped her bare feet into garden shoes and stepped outside. The afternoon sun caressed her shoulders as she made her way down the stone path toward her flower beds. Gardening had become her sanctuary since moving here, her hands finding purpose in the forgiving earth when they found none in the bog. Growing distance between her and Henry, for years since he'd last touched her with any real hunger, for years of chaste kisses and occasional dutiful lovemaking that left her feeling more alone than satisfied. Her body, once worshipped, had become invisible, first to him, then slowly to herself. "Those dahlias are putting on quite a show," the voice startled her. She turned to find James Ellis leaning against the low stone wall that separated their properties. Their neighbor was a widower of 5 years, a former literature professor with silver gray hair and eyes the color of sea glass. At 68, he carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone who had survived sorrow without becoming bitter. "They've decided autumn is their season," Margaret replied, offering a smile that felt unusually warm on her lips. "I wasn't expecting such a bloom so late. The most beautiful things often arrive when we've stopped looking for them." His gaze traveled slowly from her eyes to her lips, then lower, lingering on the curve of her breasts beneath her thin gardening shirt. The heat of his appraisal awakened something dormant within her, a fluttering sensation she hadn't felt in years. That evening, preparing dinner alone, Henry had taken his call to the study. Margaret found herself recalling the way James had looked at her. Like she was still worth seeing. Like her body, with its softened edges and marks of time, still held the power to arouse desire. She caught her reflection in the kitchen window, the curve of her waist, the fullness of her breasts, and for the first time in years, she looked at herself through the eyes of want rather than criticism. The following Thursday, she encountered James at the local bookstore, his arms cradling a stack of poetry collections. "My guilty pleasure," he confessed with a self-deprecating smile. "At my age, I should probably be reading practical things about retirement accounts or managing arthritis, and deprive the world of one more romantic soul." "That would be criminal," she replied, surprised by the flirtation in her voice. They shared coffee at the small cafe tucked into the corner of the bookshop. He recommended Wallace Stevens. She spoke of her love for Mary Oliver. The conversation flowed like water finding its natural path. When his knee pressed against hers, beneath the small table, she didn't pull away. The contact sent electricity through her body, awakening nerve endings she'd forgotten existed. "I find myself thinking about you," James said quietly, his eyes holding hers across the table. More than is probably wise, the honesty in his voice made her breath catch. "I've been thinking about you too." His hand moved across the table, fingers brushing hers. "We're not young people stumbling blindly into passion," he said. "We know exactly where this path could lead." "Yes," she whispered. "We do." The rain continued its percussion against the windows as they sat in silence, fingers intertwined, standing at the edge of something both terrifying and exhilarating. Their meetings continued, Thursdays at the bookstore cafe, occasional accidental on-purpose encounters at the grocery store or post office. Each time, the current between them grew stronger, more insistent. Margaret began dressing with more care, rediscovering silk blouses and scented lotions long forgotten in the back of her drawers. Henry, perpetually distracted by work even in retirement, barely noticed the change. One Thursday in mid-October, rain pounded against the windows of the Ida Sai cafe with unusual ferocity. "My house is just down the street," James said as they watched the deluge. "We could wait out the storm there. I've just opened a bottle of remarkable Cabernet that deserves appreciation." The invitation hung between them, its true meaning clear in his eyes. Margaret thought of Henry, probably still on his conference call, oblivious to the storm both outside and within her. "I'd like that," she said, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. James's house was like him, thoughtful, cultured, warm. Books lined every wall, and the furniture invited comfort, rather than formality. He poured wine into crystal glasses, his fingers brushing hers as he handed one to her. To unexpected pleasures he toasted, his eyes never leaving hers. The wine was rich and smooth on her tongue. They sat close on his sofa, discussing poetry and travel and the Leiden province, until words became secondary to the electricity flowing between them. When his hand cupped her cheek, she leaned into his touch like a flower seeking the sun. "I want you, Margaret," he said, his voice low and rough with desire. "I've wanted you since the first moment I saw you in your garden. But I need to hear you say it. I want you too," she whispered, the truth of it pulsing through her body. "I want to feel alive again. I want to be touched like I matter." His kiss was gentle at first, then hungry with need. Margaret felt herself respond with an intensity that shocked her. This wasn't the tepid arousal she'd grown accustomed to in recent years, but something molten and demanding. When his hands moved beneath her blouse, caressing the sensitive skin of her waist, she gasped with pleasure. "We can stop," he murmured against her neck. "We don't have to. Don't stop," she interrupted, pulling him closer. "Please, don't stop." They made love on his sofa, too impatient to find the bedroom. He undressed her slowly, his eyes darkening with appreciation as each piece of clothing fell away. When she moved to cover the softness of her stomach, the silvery stretch marks from pregnancies, decades past, he gently pulled her hands away. "Let me see you," he said. "All of you. You're magnificent." He worshipped her body with his hands and mouth, finding places of pleasure she'd forgotten existed. Margaret surrendered to sensation, her back arching as his tongue traced patterns across her breasts, her stomach, between her thighs. When he finally entered her, she cried out in raw pleasure, her nails digging into his shoulders. "Beautiful," he whispered against her ear, his movements slow and deliberate. So beautiful. Afterward, lying tangled together beneath a throw blanket, the rain still drumming against the windows, Margaret felt simultaneously ancient and newborn. "Never thought I'd feel this way again," she confessed, her head resting on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart. "I thought this part of me had died with youth." He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "We're taught that passion belongs to the young, as though desire has an expiration date. Another lie society tells us about aging." In the weeks that followed, Margaret lived a double life. Mornings with Henry, sharing breakfast in companionable silence, discussing practical matters of bill payments and home repairs. Afternoons with James, their bodies and minds intertwining with increasing familiarity and deepening need. She discovered a hunger in herself she'd thought long extinguished. Sometimes they barely made it through the door before tearing at each other's clothes, taking each other against walls or on kitchen counters, laughing at their own urgency. Other times, they spent hours in his bed, exploring each other's bodies, with deliberate slowness, finding all the places that made the other moan or gasp or beg. He taught her to ask for what she wanted, to voice desires she'd kept silent for decades. In turn, she learned the geography of his body, the surgical scar on his lower back, the constellation of freckles on his shoulder, the way he groaned when she took him in her mouth, the sensitive spot at the base of his neck that made him shudder when she pressed her lips there. "You've awakened something in me," she told him one afternoon as they lay spent and glistening with sweat in his rumpled bed. "Something I thought was gone forever." "It was never gone," he said, his fingers tracing lazy circles on her hip. "Just dormant, waiting for the right touch." The guilt came later, arriving not during their passionate encounters but in the quiet moments at home. Watching Henry doze in, his armchair, his reading glasses sliding down his nose, she felt the weight of her deception like a stone in her stomach. He had been a good husband, faithful if distant. He had provided, protected, parented alongside her. Did 36 years of marriage mean nothing against the intoxication of new desire? "You seem different," Henry remarked one evening as they prepared for bed. Happier, somehow, the observation, delivered with mild curiosity rather than suspicion, pierced her heart. "Do I?" "It suits you," he said, offering a smile that reminded her of earlier years. He kissed her forehead before turning out the light, a chaste gesture that now felt like an indictment. That night, she lay awake beside her sleeping husband, wondering, when they had stopped reaching for each other in the darkness. When had comfort replaced passion? When had they accepted the slow death of desire as an inevitable consequence of long marriage? The affair continued through autumn, leaves falling from trees in brilliant surrender as Margaret fell deeper into her relationship with James. They found secret places to meet: his house when the neighboring cottages were empty, hidden corners of the beach on weekday mornings, once even a hotel 2 towns over, where they spent a glorious afternoon making love and reading poetry a lab between passionate encounters. It was in this hotel, watching sunset paint the walls with amber light, that James first spoke of a future. "We could have more than stolen. Ours," he said, his finger tracing patterns on her bare shoulder. "We could have mornings and evenings, every day." The implication hung in the air between them. "You're asking me to leave, Henry," she said, her voice steady despite the earthquake happening in her chest. "I'm asking you to choose happiness, your happiness, at the cost of destroying someone who has given me a lifetime." James didn't argue. He understood the complexity, the history that bound her to a marriage that had lost its fire, but not its foundation. I would never pressure you," he said finally. "I just want you to know that my door is open. If you ever walk through it, I'll be waiting." The following week brought the first real crisis. Margaret returned home from meeting James to find Henry sitting at the kitchen table, his face ashen. "Caroline called," he said, referring to their neighbor. "She thought I should know she saw you entering James Ellis's house last Tuesday and leaving several hours later." The floor seemed to shift beneath Margaret's feet. "Henry," she mentioned, "it's..." Not the first time his voice remained steady, but his hands trembled as they rested on the table. "Is there something I should know?" The question hung in the air, offering her a choice: lie, or shatter the life they'd built together. Margaret sank into the chair opposite him, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. "Yes," she said simply, "there is." What followed was the most honest conversation they'd had in decades. Margaret spoke of loneliness within their marriage, of feeling invisible as she aged, of the joy she'd found in being desired again, of the physical hunger that had reawakened in her after years of dormancy. "When was the last time you really touched me, Henry? Not out of habit or obligation, but because you wanted me? When was the last time you looked at my body with desire instead of familiarity?" Her questions hung in the air between them, painful in their accuracy. Henry listened, his face a mask of pain and bewilderment. "I never stopped loving you," he said when she finished. "I just forgot how to show it. When did we stop seeing each other, Margaret? When did we become strangers sharing a house?" "I don't know," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "It happened so gradually I barely noticed until the distance became an ocean." That night, Henry slept in the guest room. Margaret lay awake, in their bed, the sheets cold beside her, weighing what she had done against what she had gained. The next morning, Henry announced he was going to stay with their son in Boston for a while. "I need time to think," he said, his suitcase already packed by the door. "And so do you." After he left, the house echoed with his absence. Margaret moved through rooms that suddenly seemed too large, too empty. She didn't contact James. This was a reckoning she needed to face alone. 3 days into Henry's absence, Margaret woke to the sound of someone at the door. She opened it to find James standing on her porch, concern etched into his features. "I heard Henry left town," he said. "Are you all right?" She didn't invite him in. "He knows about us." James nodded, unsurprised. Small towns have big eyes. "I need time, James. This isn't just about us. It's about 36 years of my life. It's about vows I made." He reached for her hand, but she kept it at her side. "I understand," he said, though disappointment shadowed his eyes. "I'll be here when you're ready to talk." The weeks that followed were the loneliest of Margaret's life. Henry remained in Boston, their phone conversations brief and laden with unspoken pain. James respected her request for space, though occasionally she would find evidence of his thoughts. A book of poetry in her mailbox, fresh dahlias on her porch swing. Winter descended on Harborview, bringing with it bitter winds and early darkness. Margaret found herself standing at windows, watching snow fall onto an empty garden, wondering how she had arrived at this desolate crossroads. One evening, as a particularly fierce storm battered the coast, the power went out. Margaret lit candles and wrapped herself in a blanket, listening to the wind howl around the eaves of the empty house. When a knock came at her door, she half expected to find James, but it was Henry who stood on the threshold, snowflakes melting in his gray hair. "May I come in?" he asked, his voice nearly lost in the wind. They sat before the fireplace, mugs of tea warming their hands, silence stretching between them like the winter night outside. "I've been seeing a therapist in Boston," Henry finally said, trying to understand what happened to us. Not just this affair, but the years before it. How we drifted so far apart without noticing. Margaret nodded, tears threatening. "I've been asking myself the same questions. Do you love him?" Henry asked, the question direct but not accusatory. She considered lying, then discarded the thought. They had had enough dishonesty. "Yes, but differently than I've loved you. It's new and exciting, but it doesn't have the roots our love has. It doesn't have history. Do you want to be with him?" "I don't know," she admitted. "Some days I think I do. Other days, I miss what we had, or what we could have again, if we tried." Henry set down his mug and reached for her hand. "I don't want to lose you, Margaret, but I don't want to keep you if staying makes you unhappy." He took a deep breath. "I want to touch you again. Really touch you. I want to learn your body again if you'll let me." The fire crackled in the grate, shadows dancing across their joined hands. "I'd like to try again," Henry said. "Not to continue as we were, but to rediscover each other. To find out if there's still something worth fighting for." Margaret felt tears spill down her cheeks. "What if we try and fail? What if we can't find our way back? Then at least we'll know we tried." He squeezed her hand. "I'm not asking for promises. Just time. Time to see if we can build something new from the ashes of what burned out." That night, for the first time in years, Henry looked at her naked body with real hunger in his eyes. His hands, tentative at first, then more confident, relearned the curves and hollows of her form. Margaret closed her eyes and surrendered to his touch, surprised to find desire rising within her, different from what she felt with James, but no, less real. "Show me," Henry whispered against her skin. "Show me what you like, what you need." And she did, guiding his hands, his mouth, finding a new language of intimacy between them, honest in a way they had never been before. When they finally came together, it was with a passion that took them both by surprise, leaving them breathless and wondering at what had been dormant but not dead between them. The next morning, Margaret walked to James's house, her footprints leaving a solitary trail in the fresh snow. He opened the door before she could knock, as though he'd been waiting. "Henry came home last night," she said. Pain flashed across James's face, quickly masked. "I see. We've decided to try again. To see if we can rebuild what we've lost." He nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. "I always knew this was a possibility." "You gave me something precious, James. You helped me remember I'm still alive, still a woman with desires and needs, still capable of passion and joy. I'll never forget that gift. But you're choosing him," he said, his voice gentle despite the hurt evident in his eyes. "I'm choosing to honor 40 years before I walk away from them. I need to know if there's anything left to save." James stepped forward, gathering her into his arms one last time. She breathed in his familiar scent, books and cedar and coffee, memorizing it. "If it doesn't work," he whispered against her hair, "if you find you can't rebuild what's broken, my door will still be open." She stepped back, her hands lingering on his chest before falling away. "Goodbye, James." Spring came to Harborview with its promise of renewal. Margaret planted her garden with Henry working beside her, their hands occasionally brushing in the dark soil. They attended marriage counseling in the neighboring town, learning to speak truths long buried, to listen with new ears. Some days were harder than others. There were arguments that opened old wounds, silences that threatened to become permanent. But there were also discoveries. Henry's unexpected talent for baking bread, Margaret's rediscovered love of painting. They touched each other with growing confidence, relearning the language of desire that had been forgotten but not lost. One evening in late April, as they walked along the beach at sunset, Henry took her hand. "I saw James at the market yesterday." Margaret tensed. "Oh, we talked for a while. He seems like a good man." "He is," she said carefully. Henry stopped walking, turning to face her. "I'm not blind, Margaret. I see how sometimes your eyes look for him when we're in town. I know there will always be a part of you that wonders what if." She started to protest, but he gently placed a finger on her lips. "It's all right. We all carry might-have-beens." He cupped her face in his hands. "But I want you to know that I see you now. All of you. And I choose you. Every day. Not out of habit or history, but because the woman you are today still takes my breath away." That night, as Henry slept beside her, Margaret gazed out at the star-filled sky visible through their bedroom window. She thought of James, hoping he would find someone to share his poetry and passion. She thought of the woman she had been before, invisible, fading, resigned to emotional hibernation. And she thought of the woman she was becoming, awake, seen, choosing her life rather than simply living it. Outside, the tide pulled at the shore, in its ancient rhythm of departure and return. Margaret closed her eyes and listened to Henry's breathing beside her, understanding at last that love wasn't just passion or comfort, but the daily choice to see and be seen, to leave and return, to forgive and begin again. In the darkness, she reached for her husband's hand and found it already reaching for hers. The end.